Dylan Cross grabbed Lena's rifle out of her hands in front of the entire platoon and held it up like a joke. "This weapon has seen more combat than you ever will, trainee." 60 soldiers erupted. Lena didn't reach for it back, didn't blink. She looked at Dylan the way someone looks at a clock, measuring, not threatened. "Put it down, Sergeant," she said quietly. One sentence. The laughter died faster than it started. Something in her voice didn't belong to a trainee. Dylan felt it before he understood it. He put the rifle down. The platoon went silent. Desert Serpent had returned, and nobody in that formation knew it yet. If this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The bag hit the sand at exactly 0600 hours. That detail mattered not because anyone was watching the clock, but because Fort Redstone ran on schedule the way a machine runs on oil, constantly, mercilessly, without compassion for anyone who fell behind. The morning formation had assembled before the sun, cleared the eastern ridge. 63 soldiers standing in precise lines on the parade ground, their boots raising small clouds of dust with every shift of weight. The heat was already building, pressing down from a sky so pale it looked washed out, and the air tasted of alkali and dry rock. Lena Carter stood at the back of the formation. She had arrived at 0545, signed in with the duty sergeant, and been directed to stand with the 17th Desert Reconnaissance Platoon, without ceremony, without introduction, and without anyone looking directly at her for more than 2 seconds. The duty sergeant had glanced at her orders, stamped them, and turned back to his coffee before the ink dried. That was the full extent of her welcome to Fort Redstone. She was fine with that. She had been watching the base since she stepped off the transport. Not the way a tourist watches tracking landmarks and memorizing streets. The way a person watches when they are reading something written in a language most people don't notice, the way weight shifts before a punch lands, the way a man's eyes move right before his mouth forms a lie, the way a group of soldiers establishes hierarchy without anyone saying a word about rank. She had been reading all of it for 11 minutes by the time Dylan Cross decided to make her an example. How was the kind of soldier who walked into a room and immediately calculated where the threat was, where the exit was, and where the audience was. In that order. He had been with the 17th for 4 years, had 3 commendations framed on the wall above his bunk, and had survived 2 desert deployments that had taken men on either side of him. His reputation inside the platoon was not simply earned, it was curated. He understood the difference between respect and fear, and had learned somewhere along the way that the fastest route to the first was a well-timed display of the second. He saw Lena standing at the edge of the formation and made his decision in about 3 seconds. She was small. Not fragile-looking, but compact in a way that read to someone not paying careful attention as slight. Her uniform was clean, but broken, worn at the knees, in the way field gear gets worn after real use, rather than training exercises, though nobody noticed that. Her face was still. Not the stillness of nervousness which tends to manifest in small tremors, in eyes that won't settle in the jaw held too tight. This was a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes from someone who has learned to conserve everything, including expression. Dylan crossed the space between them in 7 long strides, and 62 soldiers turned to watch without being told to. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she would have had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. She didn't tilt her head. She held his gaze at the exact angle it met naturally, which meant she was looking somewhere around the center of his chest, and that seemed to bother him more than if she had looked directly at him with defiance. "You're Carter," he said. Not a question exactly, more like a verdict. "Yes, Sergeant." "Transfer from where?" "Fort Huachuca, Training Support Division." Someone in the 3rd row of the formation exhaled audibly, and it carried the specific pitch of suppressed amusement. Training support was administrative work. Radio logistics. The kind of posting that soldiers in reconnaissance units mentioned with the tone people use when they're technically being polite. Dylan nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they've just confirmed something they already suspected. "Training support," he repeated. "So you've never run a desert patrol?" "I've completed desert survival qualification." "That's not what I asked." Lena said nothing. Dylan reached down, unhooked the duffel from her shoulder before she could shift her weight, and held it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he dropped it onto the sand in front of the formation. The sound it made was small, a flat thud, but the silence around it was enormous. "You're in the wrong place," he said. "I don't know what your orders say, but whatever you did in training support, we don't need it here. This platoon deploys into hostile desert terrain. We operate under fire. We carry our own weight, and we carry each other's weight, and we don't carry passengers." He looked at the bag on the ground between them. "Pick that up and go find someone to reassign you." The platoon waited. Lena looked at the bag. She looked at Dylan. She crouched, picked up the bag, settled the strap on her shoulder, and then stood there looking at him with the same undisturbed expression she'd worn when he dropped it. "My orders are confirmed, Sergeant," she said. "I'm assigned to the 17th. Dylan's jaw tightened by a fraction. The soldiers in the formation registered it, the almost imperceptible shift that meant he hadn't expected that answer. He had expected embarrassment or apology, or the look people get when they're calculating whether to fight or retreat. He had gotten none of those things. "Then you'll be running communications support," he said. "Observation only. You don't make tactical calls. You don't suggest routes. You don't give opinions on enemy positions unless someone asks, and nobody is going to ask. You listen, you relay, and you stay out of the way. Are we clear?" "Clear, Sergeant." He turned and walked back toward the front of the formation without looking at her again. The soldier standing to Lena's left, a young specialist named Marcus Webb, who had been with the 17th for 8 months, leaned approximately 2 inches in her direction and said out of the corner of his mouth, "That was actually one of his friendlier welcomes." Lena said nothing, but she filed Marcus Webb into a category she kept in the back of her mind, the honest ones, and she noted that he was one of 4 soldiers in the formation who had not laughed when the bag hit the ground. Commander Ethan Marshall ran the 17th, with the kind of precision that came from having made exactly 3 catastrophic errors in his career, surviving all 3 and spending every subsequent year making sure he understood why they had happened. He was 51 years old, had 17 deployments on his record, and had the quality that distinguished genuinely experienced officers from performed competence. He listened to information before he responded to it. He reviewed Lena's transfer orders at 0730 in his office with the door closed, and he read them twice, the first time because the orders were unusually sparse. The transfer authorization was signed. The assignment was standard, but the supporting documentation that should have accompanied a specialized transfer evaluation history, skills assessments, prior unit performance was either missing or redacted to the point of uselessness. Long blocks of text replaced with single classification codes that Marshall didn't recognize from standard military documentation. He read them a second time because the first reading had produced a feeling he'd learned to trust over 30 years of service. The feeling that what was on the page was not the full picture. He picked up the phone, called the personnel office at Fort Huachuca, and asked to speak with whoever had processed Carter's transfer. There was a pause on the line. Not a long one. Maybe 4 seconds. The kind of pause that happens when someone is making a decision about how much to say. Sergeant Carter's transfer was processed through standard channels. The voice on the other end said, carefully, "Her assignment to the 17th Desert Reconnaissance Platoon is confirmed and current." "I understand that," Marshall said. "I'm asking about her evaluation history." Another pause. "Her file is complete on our end, sir. You'll need to request anything beyond the transfer documentation through classified personnel." Marshall thanked him, hung up, and sat looking at the papers for another 30 seconds. Then he set them aside and went back to the deployment brief. Med, one adjustment to the assignment roster. Instead of giving Lena a position in the patrol rotation, he placed her in radio support. It was partly caution. He didn't put soldiers into field positions without understanding their capabilities, and her file had given him almost nothing to work with, and partly something else he couldn't quite articulate. A sense that whoever had arranged this transfer knew exactly what they were doing, and that the right response was patience rather than action. He would watch. He would let the situation develop. He had been wrong before by moving too fast. He had learned to hold still. The 17th's barracks were divided into bays, and Lena was assigned a bunk at the far end of the 4th bay, which put her approximately 40 feet from the nearest other occupied bunk and directly beneath an air conditioning vent that rattled when the unit cycled. The assignment was not accidental. The far-end bunk was where the platoon put people they were not yet sure about, close enough to monitor far enough to signal separation. She unpacked methodically. Uniform items hung in precise order, boots placed at exact angles, her personal kit arranged with the economy of someone who had learned through extended fieldwork that searching for equipment in the dark was a failure of preparation you only made once. She had one personal item, a small photograph worn at the edges, that she placed face down on the shelf beside her bunk. Marcus Webb appeared at the entrance to the bay at 1100, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the mess, and stopped when he saw the photograph placed face down. Most people put photographs face up. The people who turned them over were either hiding something or protecting something. He couldn't tell which. "Coffee," he said. Lena looked at him. "Thank you." He came in, handed her the cup, and sat on the footlocker across from her bunk, with the body language of someone who had decided to take a calculated social risk. "You're going to need information," he said. "I figure the quickest way to get information in a new unit is to find someone who's willing to give it without charging anything for it." "What are you after?" He seemed to appreciate that she'd skipped the part where she denied having anything worth asking about. "Nothing specific," he said. I've been in this unit 8 months, and I've seen Cross run off 4 people he decided weren't the right fit. All of them were fine soldiers. One of them was genuinely excellent. Cross has a way of deciding things before he's seen the evidence." "And you're telling me this because you didn't fold," Marcus said. "He dropped your bag in front of the whole platoon, and you picked it up like it was something that had slipped off your shoulder on the subway. I've never seen anyone do that without looking either angry or destroyed." He paused. It made me curious. Lena looked at him for a moment, the way a person looks at something they're reading carefully. Then she took a drink of her coffee and said, "Tell me about the terrain for next week's patrol." Marcus blinked. Of all the responses, that wasn't one he'd prepared for. "The patrol route. Whatever you know. Distances, elevation changes, water sources, the sectors where you've had the most problems." He talked for 40 minutes. She asked precise questions. Not the questions of a soldier new to desert operations. Those questions were broad, safety-focused, concerned with the basics. Her questions were about specifics. Shadow timing at specific elevations. Wind pattern variations in the western sectors. The difference in vehicle track degradation between morning and afternoon heat. He answered all of them, and afterward sat for a moment feeling the particular unease of someone who has just realized the conversation was much more uneven than it appeared. "Where did you say you were stationed before here?" he said. "Fort Huachuca," Lena said. "Training support." Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't believe it. He also didn't push. The first real test came on the 3rd day. The platoon ran a training exercise in the Western Quadrant, a simulated patrol through broken terrain, designed to test navigation communication protocols and response to simulated enemy contact. Lena was assigned radio support, which meant she traveled with the main body and kept the communication channel open, but did not participate in tactical decisions. For the first 2 hours, she did exactly what she was assigned to do. Then the exercise reached the dried riverbed in the western sector, and Lena stopped walking. She stood at the edge of the riverbed and looked at the far bank for approximately 4 seconds. Then she keyed her radio. "This is Carter on comms. I'm observing potential stability issues on the north face of the crossing point. The soil composition looks like it's absorbed water recently, and the surface layer is deceptive. I'd recommend the team test the crossing at the southern approach instead." Dylan's voice came back immediately. "Carter, you're on communication support. You relay messages. You don't evaluate terrain." "Understood, Sergeant. Relaying the observation for command review." There was a brief silence on the channel. Then Commander Marshall's voice. "Noted. Continue to the primary crossing." The platoon crossed at the primary point. The lead soldier hit the north face and sank to mid-calf before 2 men hauled him back. It took 40 minutes to find and clear an alternative route. Nobody said anything to Lena directly. But on the walk back, she caught 3 separate soldiers looking at her with expressions she recognized. Not respect yet. Something earlier than respect. The first movement of attention that comes when a person has been right about something that cost everyone else time and effort. Dylan did not look at her at all, which was its own kind of answer. And that evening in the mess hall, she sat alone at the end of a table with her tray and a map of the patrol sector that she had drawn from memory on a piece of paper, marking elevation contours and the locations where she had observed specific soil colorations during the exercise. The soldier who sat down across from her without asking was named Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran who served as the platoon's senior scout and who had in 8 months of knowing Marcus Webb never once initiated a social conversation. He set his tray down, looked at the map and said, "That's the sector we're running next week." "I know," Lena said. "That soil reading at the riverbed," Rodriguez said. "You got that from looking at color gradients. And the vegetation distribution. The greasewood was growing in lines that follow subsurface moisture. The crossing point had denser root systems, which means the water table was higher there. The surface hadn't dried at the same rate as the surrounding terrain." Rodriguez looked at her for a long moment. He had the face of a man who had been lied to enough times that he'd developed a precise internal sensor for people who were telling the truth, and what he was hearing was landing clearly. "Cross thinks you're a problem." "I know that too." "He's not entirely wrong to be cautious," Rodriguez said with the frankness of someone who had given up softening things. "We run hot missions. People who overestimate themselves get other people killed." "That's correct." "But he dropped your bag in front of the whole unit," Rodriguez said, and his voice was flat when he said it, the way a person states something they consider a relevant data point. That wasn't caution, that was performance. Lena didn't respond to that. Rodriguez picked up his fork. "Where'd you learn the vegetation read?" "Experience." He looked up from his tray. She was looking at the map again. He sat with that answer for a moment and felt the same thing Marcus had felt earlier. The distinct sensation of a conversation being managed by someone who was very, very good at managing conversations. He ate his meal in silence. When he left, he picked up his tray and then, almost as an afterthought, said, "The river crossing in Grid 7, on the real mission, there's a secondary drainage that feeds into it from the north that doesn't show on the maps we have. Eats vehicles if you don't know about it." He walked away without waiting for a response. Lena added it to her map. On the 5th day, Dylan Cross stopped her in the corridor outside the briefing room. He had the bearing of someone who had thought carefully about how to have this conversation and had decided that directness was the appropriate approach. He had rehearsed it. She could tell not the words exactly, but the architecture. The setup, the confrontation, the expected response. "I want to know what your actual background is," he said. "My file is available through—" "I've read your file," he said. "There's nothing in it. I've been in this army long enough to know that a file with nothing in it isn't a file that's empty. It's a file that's been cleaned." He studied her face for a reaction. She gave him steady attention, nothing more. "I need to know who I'm deploying with." "You know what I'm assigned to do," she said. "Communication support, observation only." "That's not who you are." "It's what my orders say." He stepped slightly closer. Not threatening, more like someone trying to see something more clearly. "The riverbed rid," he said. "That wasn't training support instinct. That was field experience. Real field experience. I've had desert training." "Stop," he said. And his voice had lost the performance, now the practiced edge. What was left was simply genuine. "I'm not trying to expose you. I'm trying to keep my people alive. If you have skills I don't know about, and something goes wrong on the mission because I put you in the wrong position, that's on me." He held her gaze. "So I'm asking you directly. Who are you?" Lena was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Someone who wants to make sure your people come home. That's the only thing you need to know right now." Dylan stood there, jaw tight, working through something internal. Then he said, "You're going to follow the assignment parameters." "Yes, Sergeant." He walked away, and Lena stood in the corridor for a moment alone, and the expression that crossed her face in that instant, the one she allowed herself only when she was certain no one was watching, was not triumph, and it was not satisfaction. It was something older than both. Something that looked, if you had been close enough to see it, and trained enough to read it, like grief. The briefing for the real mission happened on day 7. Commander Marshall spread the operational map across the table and walked the platoon through the parameters. A communications relay station, approximately 60 kilometers into the deep desert, had gone dark. The station was positioned along a supply corridor that 3 forward units depended on. Intelligence suggested the area had seen increased enemy presence in the past 2 weeks, patrol sightings, vehicle tracks, a communication intercept that was incomplete but concerning. The mission was reconnaissance and restoration. Get to the station, assess the damage, restore communications, and return without direct engagement if possible. If possible was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and every soldier in the room understood it. Marshall walked through the route, the fallback positions, the communication windows. Then he laid out assignments. Lena, without announcement or fanfare, was placed in radio support at the rear of the main column. Dylan said nothing. Rodriguez from across the table glanced at Lena and looked away. When the briefing ended and the room began emptying, Marshall caught Lena's eye and held it for exactly 1 second. It was not a signal, not exactly. It was more like the acknowledgement one careful person gives to another. The recognition that both of them were doing something deliberate. She gave him a small nod. He turned and walked out. The convoy left Fort Redstone at 0400 the following morning, 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the pre-dawn desert. The cold that people who hadn't worked in desert terrain never accounted for, the way the same landscape that baked you blind at noon could make your fingers stiff and your movements slow before sunrise. The soldiers who were new to desert operations kept their jackets zipped to the collar. The veterans wore lighter layers, moved differently, had learned to work with the temperature cycle instead of against it. Lena wore a mid-layer and moved without apparent difficulty, which several people noticed and didn't comment on. The convoy traveled the first 20 kilometers without incident. The terrain was passable, the navigation clean, the communication windows holding. In the radio vehicle, Lena monitored 3 frequencies, simultaneously logging transmission quality and timing patterns, with the focus of someone who had learned to treat radio traffic the way a doctor treats vital signs, as information that told you about the health of something you couldn't directly see. At kilometer 23, she picked up something. It wasn't on their operational frequency. It was ambient, a fragment of transmission on a frequency she'd been passively monitoring, the kind of monitoring that was not in her assignment parameters, that she had started simply because the habit was older than the assignment. The fragment was 11 seconds long and encoded, but the encoding pattern was familiar in the way that patterns become familiar when you have spent a significant amount of time studying them in high-pressure situations. She didn't understand the content. She understood the structure. And the structure said that someone was coordinating vehicle movement approximately 8 to 12 kilometers ahead of their position. She keyed her radio. "This is Carter on comms. I'm picking up encoded transmissions on a secondary frequency that may indicate coordinated vehicle movement in the forward sector. Recommend we confirm before continuing at current pace." Dylan's voice came back flat. "Carter, you're monitoring assigned frequencies only. I heard this on the ambient band while running my standard check. Assigned frequencies only. That's the last time I'm going to say it." She closed the channel. She continued monitoring the ambient band. The platoon pressed forward. At kilometer 28, the lead vehicle slowed. Rodriguez's running point had spotted something on the surface of the track ahead. He dismounted, walked forward, crouched. He came back to the vehicle and got on the radio. "Vehicle tracks, multiple sets. Recent within 6 hours based on edge degradation. They're not ours." The platoon halted. Dylan called a brief command huddle around the lead vehicle. Lena stayed at the radio vehicle. She listened to the quiet and tracked the wind direction and watched the high ground to the north, which was the direction that ambient transmission pattern had suggested. Marcus came back from the huddle, climbed into the radio vehicle, and looked at Lena. "What do you know that you're not saying?" She looked at him. "Get Dylan. He's not going to—" "Marcus." Her voice was calm, but carried something underneath it. "Get Dylan. He went. Dylan arrived at the radio vehicle with the expression of a man who had decided he was going to control this conversation. He climbed in and said, "What?" "The encoded transmission I picked up," Lena said. "The structure matches a coordination pattern I've seen used in this region. Not in training, in operation." She met his eyes. "There are at least 2 vehicles positioned on the high ground north of our current position. They've been there since before we arrived. They're waiting for us to commit to the approach toward the station before they move." Dylan was quiet. "How do you know that?" he said, and his voice had lost its practiced edge again. "Because that's how this particular pattern works," she said. "Let the target commit to the route, cut off the retreat, hit from above when there's no easy alternative." He stared at her. "You said an operation?" "Yes." "Training support doesn't run operations." She held his gaze. He looked at the map. At the high ground she'd indicated. At the vehicle tracks Rodriguez had called in. He worked through it in silence, and she could see the exact moment when the arithmetic resolved in a direction. He didn't want the moment when the evidence was more convincing than the resistance. "If you're wrong," he said. "I'm not wrong," she said. Not with arrogance, with the flatness of someone stating a thing they know. He got on the radio to Commander Marshall. Marshall listened to the full report without interrupting. Then he said, "Carter, you're on." Dylan looked at her. She was already studying the map. "We need 2 scouts on the ridge 200 meters east," she said. "Not the high ground north, they're watching the high ground. The east ridge is in their blind spot based on the transmission angle. From there we can confirm positions. If I'm right, we have enough time to redirect the column to the secondary approach through the drainage valley. It adds 40 minutes but avoids the kill zone entirely." "And if we just wait," Marshall said over the radio, "they'll know we've spotted them within another 20 minutes. Once they know we're stationary and aware, they'll reposition and we lose the timing advantage." Silence on the channel. Then, "Rodriguez, take Webb and get eyes on the east ridge. Carter, maintain your position and keep that frequency monitored. Cross-prepare the column for potential route change." Dylan looked at Lena one more time. She had already turned back to the radio equipment headset on focus complete, as if the conversation had been a brief interruption in work she'd never stopped doing. He climbed out of the vehicle. Rodriguez and Marcus went up the east ridge. 7 minutes later, Rodriguez's voice came over the radio with the controlled tension of an experienced soldier delivering information he wishes he didn't have. "Command, this is Rodriguez. We have eyes on 2 vehicles on the north high ground, stationary, armed. I count 6 personnel, at least 3 with long-range optics. They are absolutely watching the approach to the station." The radio was quiet for 2 seconds. Then Marshall said very calmly, "Carter, route change. Walk us through the drainage valley." Lena pulled the map closer, and the platoon that had laughed at the trainee with the dropped duffel bag listened to her voice in their earpieces and followed every word she said. They reached the communications station 90 minutes later through the drainage valley, arriving at the station from an angle that the waiting vehicles had no sightline on. The station damage was repairable. The communication window held. Rodriguez called in the positions of the waiting vehicles to command, and within 3 hours, a separate unit had moved to intercept. Nobody fired a shot. The 17th Desert Reconnaissance Platoon completed the mission and turned the column back toward Fort Redstone as the sun began its descent toward the western ridgeline, painting the desert in colors that meant nothing to any of them, except that the day had ended without a body count. Lena sat in the radio vehicle on the return journey and monitored her frequencies. Nobody said anything to her for the first 40 minutes. Then, Dylan Cross climbed into the vehicle at a rest halt, sat across from her in the cramped space and looked at her for a long moment. 6 personnel with long-range optics on the high ground, he said. Yes. Coordinating to hit us in the approach. Yes. And you knew that from 11 seconds of encoded ambient transmission. She said nothing. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower. I need you to help me understand what I'm looking at, he said. Because the person in front of me right now is not someone who worked training support logistics at Fort Huachuca. The vehicle rocked gently over the terrain. Lena looked at the map in her hands, and then looked at Dylan Cross, and for the first time since she had arrived at Fort Redstone, her expression moved in a direction that was not neutral. Not far. But enough. You kept your people alive today, she said. You kept my people alive today. Same thing, she said. If the decision-making is good, it doesn't matter who provided the information. He sat back. He looked out the small window at the desert moving past. When he looked back at her, something in his face had shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of a conversion, but in the way of someone whose framework for understanding a situation has been quietly significantly altered. Who are you? He said. The question was different this time, softer, without the edge of command, without the architecture of a confrontation. It was simply a person asking another person a genuine question. Lena looked at him. She did not answer. But the photograph she kept face down on the shelf beside her bunk, the one she had placed there on her first day without letting anyone see what it showed, would have answered the question if anyone had ever turned it over. It was a photograph of a team. 7 people, desert terrain gear worn down to the material underneath. All of them lean, all of them looking at the camera with the specific expression of soldiers who have been through something that words were inadequate for. In the center of the group, younger by several years, hair shorter, a scar on her left jaw that was barely visible now, but had been fresh then, was Lena Carter. And written along the bottom of the photograph in the handwriting of someone who had survived alongside her were 4 words. Nobody had seen them. Nobody knew they were there, but they were there. Desert Serpent. Never again. The convoy rolled back through the gates of Fort Redstone at 2140 hours, and the base was quiet, the way military installations get quiet at night. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended, like something holding its breath. The vehicles shut down one by one, and the soldiers climbed out with the particular heaviness of people who had been prepared for violence and had not experienced it, which was its own kind of exhaustion. The tension had nowhere to go. It just settled into the muscles and stayed there. Lena was the last one out of the radio vehicle. She pulled her gear and walked toward the barracks without speaking to anyone, and nobody spoke to her. But the quality of the silence around her had changed since the morning. When she had walked across that same ground 14 hours earlier, the silence was dismissal. Now it was something else. Not acceptance, too early for that, and she knew better than to mistake the absence of hostility for its opposite. But the soldiers who passed her in the corridor didn't look through her the way they had yesterday. They looked at her the way you look at something you're still trying to understand. She put her gear away, sat on the edge of her bunk, and looked at the photograph face down on the shelf. She didn't turn it over. She left it as it was and went to sleep. Dylan Cross sat in this common room for 2 hours after the debrief, long after the other soldiers had gone to their bunks with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand. He wasn't drinking it. He was holding it the way people hold objects when their hands need something to do while their mind is somewhere else entirely. Rodriguez found him there at 23:30 and sat down without being invited, because Rodriguez had known Dylan long enough to know when an invitation was coming, and when you just had to show up anyway. "Say it," Dylan said. "You already know what I'm going to say." "Say it anyway." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "She called it before we had anything, before the tracks, before any visual confirmation. She pulled that from 11 seconds of radio noise that none of the rest of us were even monitoring." He paused. "And you told her to stay on assigned frequencies." "I know what I told her. If she'd followed that order completely." "I know," Dylan said, and his voice had a hard edge not toward Rodriguez, but toward something internal that was giving him trouble. "She didn't follow it completely. She kept listening anyway. And that saved us." Dylan set the cold coffee down. "Rodriguez, her file has nothing in it. You've been in long enough to know what that means." "Means somebody cleaned it." "Why would somebody clean a training support logistics sergeant's file?" Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "They wouldn't," he said. "No," Dylan said. "They wouldn't." The two men sat with that for a while. Outside the window, the desert was dark and motionless and completely indifferent. "She said in operation," Dylan said. "When she was explaining the transmission pattern, she said she'd seen it in operation, not in training, in operation." Rodriguez looked at him. "I caught that too," Rodriguez said quietly. "So who is she?" Rodriguez didn't answer. because he didn't have an answer, and they both understood that the question was going to stay open until Lena Carter decided otherwise, and she was clearly someone who decided things on her own timeline. Dylan finally stood up, poured the cold coffee down the sink and said, "Full mission brief tomorrow at 0700. New intelligence came in from command while we were in the field. There's a second assignment." Rodriguez raised his eyebrows. "Already? Apparently the station we restored last night was transmitting something before it went dark. Command wants to know what it was. That means going back out." He walked out of the common room, and Rodriguez sat alone for another minute, looking at nothing in particular with the specific expression of an experienced soldier who has the feeling that the next few days are going to be significantly more complicated than the last ones. He was not wrong. The 0700 briefing. The next morning was standing room only. Commander Marshall had requested full platoon presence, which happened rarely enough that it brought people in quickly and soberly. Lena arrived at 0655 and stood at the back, which was where she had stood for every briefing since her arrival. Not because she was told to, but because the back gave her the full field of view. Marshall laid out the new intelligence with the directness that made him effective at his job. The communication station they had restored the previous night had, according to signal analysts, been transmitting an encrypted data packet approximately 4 hours before it went dark. The packet had not been fully recovered, but its destination was traceable. It had been routed toward a civilian infrastructure node that had no military function and no business receiving encrypted military signals. Someone at or near that station had been leaking data. The mission was no longer simple restoration. It was investigation. The platoon was going back out to find evidence of how the leak had happened, who had access, and whether the leak was ongoing through other channels. Marshall paused after the briefing and said, "Carter, stay." The room cleared. Dylan stayed too without being asked because Marshall looked at him and didn't tell him to leave, which was its own form of invitation. When the last soldier was gone, Marshall put both hands flat on the table and looked at Lena in the way he'd been careful not to look at her in front of others, direct without the filter. "I need to know what I'm working with," he said. "My assignment parameters." "I'm not asking about your assignment parameters," Marshall said. "I'm asking about you, because what happened out there yesterday was not communications support. That was intelligence-level pattern recognition under field conditions, and it saved this platoon from walking into a coordinated ambush." He waited. "So I'll ask you once, and I want a real answer. What is your background?" Lena looked at the map on the table, at the coordinates of the communication station, at the notation Marshall had added in pencil along the margin, a question mark beside the civilian infrastructure node. "I have field experience with signals intelligence and close reconnaissance," she said. "The specifics of that experience are not something I'm authorized to discuss." "Not authorized," Marshall repeated. "That's correct, sir." He studied her face. "Does the authorization restriction come from you or from someone above you?" She met his eyes. "From above me, sir." Marshall straightened. He looked at Dylan, who was standing near the door with his arms at his sides, processing something. Then he looked back at Lena. "The civilian infrastructure node," he said. "If someone was routing encrypted military signals through it, that requires either significant technical capability or inside knowledge of the routing architecture. Possibly both." "Yes, sir." "Which means whoever is responsible either had help from someone with access to our systems, or they are someone with access to our systems." "Yes, sir." The room was very quiet. Marshall said, "What do you need?" It was the question that shifted everything. Not "who are you?" Not "explain yourself." Not "prove it," simply "what do you need?" Lena recognized it immediately as the question of a man who had made his assessment and moved past the part where he questioned it. "Access to the station's full transmission log from the 48 hours before it went dark," she said. "And a private channel on a frequency not routed through the base's standard communication system." "The second one is harder," Marshall said. "I know." "But not impossible," he said. Dylan made a sound that was not quite a word. Both of them looked at him. He had the expression of someone standing at the edge of something very large and understanding for the first time how large it actually was. "She's not here for the mission," he said slowly. She was here before the mission existed. She was already here when the mission was assigned. He looked at Lena. You were sent here for this, the data leak. You were already looking for it. Lena said nothing. That's not nothing, Dylan said. That's confirmation. Marshall put his hand up slightly, not silencing Dylan, more like asking him to slow down. If that's the case, he said to Lena, then there are people on this base who are part of what you're looking for. Possibly, she said. And you've been here 8 days watching us. Yes, sir. And you haven't found what you're looking for yet. No, sir, not yet. Dylan exhaled. So everyone on this base is a suspect. Everyone with access to the station's routing architecture, Lena said. That's a smaller list than everyone. How small? Marshall said. 11 people, she said. Based on the access records from the system logs I've been able to review. Marshall was quiet. Then, you've already pulled the access logs. 3 days ago. He looked at her for a long time. And then, remarkably, the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. You have been busy, he said. I've been doing my job, sir. Dylan made another sound. This one had something involuntary in it. Something that recognized absurdity, the duffel bag on the sand, the 63 soldiers laughing. The woman who had stood there and picked it up without changing expression, who had been 3 days into an active investigation before she ever walked into formation. The 11 people, he said. Am I on the list? Lena looked at him. You were. Were. You're not anymore. He absorbed that. When did I come off it? The riverbed, she said. Kilometer 23. He stared at her. You cleared me because of how I responded to a terrain call. I cleared you because of why you responded the way you did, she said. You dismissed the call because you'd already decided what I was. That's a different motivation than someone who's covering information because they need it concealed. Arrogance leaves a different signature than deception. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when something true has been said in a room, and everyone present knows it. Dylan sat down. He looked at the table. He looked like a man who was in the process of revising something fundamental about how he understood the last 8 days. I threw your bag on the ground, he said. Yes. In front of the whole platoon. Yes. And you were 3 days into an active investigation. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. That must have been... It was what it was, Lena said, not dismissively, with the practical economy of someone who has learned that certain experiences are more useful acknowledged than analyzed. The cover was necessary. A trainee who gets embarrassed on her first day and keeps her head down is unremarkable. Unremarkable was what I needed. Dylan looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his face that was complicated and didn't have a clean name. The 10 remaining people on the list, Marshall said, bringing them back. What's your next step? I need to go back to the station, she said. In person. The transmission log will tell me the timing, but the physical routing setup will tell me the method, and the method will narrow the list. We're going back out tomorrow, Marshall said. I know. Same route. Different route, she said. The vehicles on the high ground yesterday were positioned specifically on the northern approach. If they were positioned by someone who knew our route. Someone on base fed them our route, Dylan said. That's one possibility. Or they guessed, Marshall said. They guessed precisely, Lena said. The positioning was too specific for general patrol interdiction. They knew the route, the timing, and the size of our column. The implication settled into the room like something with physical weight. Someone in this platoon, Dylan said. His voice was flat, controlled, but underneath it something that sounded like fury held very still. Someone with access to the operational plan, Lena said, which could be someone in the platoon or someone in command support with visibility into the briefing materials. Either way, Marshall said, we plan tomorrow's route in this room, the 3 of us, nobody else. Lena nodded. Dylan looked at the map, at the station coordinates, at the line of the route they had taken the previous day, and at the high ground where 6 armed personnel had waited for them with long-range optics and patience. The people who were waiting for us yesterday, he said. They didn't engage when we changed routes. They let us go. Yes, Lena said. Why, if they knew we were coming, why let us reach the station at all? Because their objective wasn't to stop us from reaching the station, she said. Their objective was the station itself. They needed to know whether we would restore communications. We did restore communications. Yes, she said. He looked at her. So they got what they needed. When we restored the station, we made it transmit again. Whatever channel was being used for the data leak, it's active again. And whoever is using it doesn't know yet that we know about it. The room went very quiet again. We just opened the door, Marshall said slowly. We opened the door, Lena confirmed. And now we need to watch what walks through it. Marshall straightened, rolled the map, and looked at both of them with the expression of a commander who has just received information that significantly changes the operational landscape and is deciding how fast to move. Full mission brief tomorrow at 0500. Restricted attendance, team leads only. Route planning in this room stays in this room. He looked at Lena. You'll run communications again. Same cover. Understood. And Carter. He paused. If you find what you're looking for on this mission, if you identify who on this base is responsible, you bring it to me before you act on it. Whatever your actual mandate is, whatever you've been authorized to do, you bring it to me first. It was not a request. Lena looked at him. Yes, sir. He walked out. Dylan stayed. He and Lena stood on opposite sides of the table for a moment, and the space between them had a different quality now than it had on every previous occasion. The dynamic that had organized everything. The sergeant and the trainee, the expert and the outsider had dissolved so completely that neither of them was quite sure what replaced it yet. 11 people, Dylan said. And you've been watching all of us for 8 days. Yes. What did you see about me specifically, before you cleared me? She considered the question. You decided immediately that I didn't belong here. Your instinct was to establish the hierarchy before you had any actual information about who I was. That's not a character flaw, it's a pattern, and it tells me something specific about what you're protecting. What am I protecting? Your people, she said simply. Every aggressive response you've had toward me has been about protecting the unit from an unknown variable. That's not what someone looks like when they're hiding something for personal gain. He was quiet for a moment. And the others on the original list? Different signatures, she said. I'll tell you what I can when I can. That's not very reassuring. I know. He picked up the rolled map from where Marshall had left it, turned it in his hands, and then set it back down. I owe you an apology, he said. For the bag, for the formation, for all of it. You were working with what you had. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed. It's not. But it's an explanation, and those are different things. He looked at her. You're very careful with words. Yes. Is that training? Some of it, she said. He nodded slowly, like someone accepting a partial answer as the best available option. I'm going to go brief Rodriguez on the restricted detail. He needs to know the route is changing. He moved toward the door, then stopped. The photograph on your shelf, the one you put face down. She was still. I don't know who's in it, he said. I'm not asking, but whatever it is, whatever happened before you came here, you should know that the people in this platoon are worth protecting. He paused. Even the ones who haven't earned it yet. He left. Lena stood in the empty briefing room for a moment. Then she pulled her notebook from her jacket pocket and opened it to the page with 11 names. She looked at the list. She drew a slow, deliberate line through 2 more names based on what she'd observed in the past 8 days. 9 names remaining. One of them was feeding intelligence to the people who had been waiting on the high ground with long-range optics. One of them had sent 63 soldiers into a potential kill zone. She put the notebook away and went to find Marcus Webb because she needed someone whose instincts she trusted to tell her something about a name on the list that the access records alone couldn't explain. Marcus was in the vehicle bay, running maintenance on the radio equipment, which was where he went when he needed to think, because working with his hands and thinking were not separate activities for him. He looked up when she came in and registered her expression with the accuracy of someone who had been paying close attention for 8 days. "What do you need?" he said. "Sergeant First Class Gerald Holt," she said. "Command support, logistics coordination." Marcus's hands slowed on the equipment. "Holt. You know him." "Everybody knows Holt," he said. "He's been at this base longer than anyone in the platoon, before Marshall even." "Tell me about him." Marcus set down his tools and looked at her with the expression of someone making a careful decision. "He's competent," he said. "Very competent. Runs logistics like a machine. Never a supply failure, never a missed deadline. He knows every route in and out of this base, every access corridor, every supply schedule." He paused. "And he's the kind of person who makes you feel like you should be grateful he hasn't noticed a mistake you made yet." "What kind of mistake?" "Any kind," Marcus said. "He collects them, not to report them, to hold them. You get the feeling he knows things about people that they don't know he knows." Lena looked at him. "Is his name on a short list you've been keeping?" Marcus was quiet for a beat. "I'm a specialist who runs radio support," he said carefully. "Marcus." He exhaled. "Yeah," he said. "His name has been on a short list in my head for about 3 weeks. Since I noticed that our supply rotation schedule matches the timing of the enemy patrol contacts in the eastern sector almost exactly. Once could be coincidence. Twice is a pattern. 3 times is correlation," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it," he said. "I'm a specialist. You don't go to command with a theory, you go with evidence." "The transmission log from the station," she said. "If Holt's credentials show up in the routing access, that's evidence." Marcus looked at her for a long time. "You're not communications support," he said. "I'm whatever the situation needs," she said. He picked up his tools again slowly and went back to the equipment. "How close are you?" he said. "Close," she said. "But I need to get to the station tomorrow, and I need the routing logs intact. If Holt knows we're looking, he'll sanitize them," Marcus said immediately. "Yes." "Does he know you're here? Specifically, I mean, does he know what you actually are?" She thought about that. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's one of the things I need to find out tomorrow." Marcus worked for a moment in silence. Then, "The vehicle we used for comms yesterday. I've been doing maintenance on it. If someone accessed the routing relay while we were at the station, there might be a secondary log stored in the vehicle's own system. It's not the same as the station log, but it would show any frequency hijacking during our operation window." Lena looked at him. "You've been sitting on that," she said. "I pulled it this afternoon," he said. "I didn't know who to bring it to." He reached into the equipment panel and retrieved a small data drive. He held it out. "Holt's access code shows up twice in the frequency log during our operational window yesterday. He wasn't in the field, he was on base." She took the drive. The weight of it in her hand was unremarkable, small, light, the kind of thing you could lose in a jacket pocket. But it was the first concrete piece of evidence she had, the first thing that moved Holt from a name on a list to a person with a file, and that was a different kind of weight entirely. "This doesn't leave your knowledge," she said. "What knowledge?" Marcus said, and went back to his maintenance. She walked out of the vehicle bay and into the dry air of the base compound, and she held the data drive in her closed hand and thought about Gerald Holt, who had been at Fort Redstone longer than anyone, who knew every route and every schedule, who collected other people's mistakes like currency. She thought about the 6 armed personnel on the high ground patient and positioned, waiting for a column of soldiers to commit to a route that someone had told them hours before it was finalized. She thought about the photograph on her shelf, face down, the 7 people in it, the inscription along the bottom. The last time she had been this close to the center of something, she had been operating with a full team and full authorization and every tool available to her. She had still been too slow. Not by much, but enough. This time she was operating with a cover identity, a data drive the size of her thumb. One specialist who had put pieces together on his own, and a sergeant who had thrown her bag on the ground in front of 63 people 8 days ago, and was now apparently one of the people she trusted most on this base. She turned the data drive over in her hand. Tomorrow, they were going back to the station, and whoever had been feeding their operational details to armed personnel in the desert was going to do one of 2 things. When the comms link came alive again, either go quiet because they were frightened, or send another transmission because they believed they were still invisible. Lena was counting on the second one, because frightened people close their hands around the second one, because frightened people close their hands around what they're hiding. But people who believe they haven't been seen, they keep moving. They can't help it. The leak is also the lifeline, and you don't cut the lifeline just because someone asked a few questions. She had learned that in a different desert, in a different year, from a man who had taught her everything worth knowing about staying alive in hostile territory. Most of those lessons she had kept. Some of them she had paid for. She went back to her bunk. She turned the photograph over for the first time since she'd arrived. She looked at it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she turned it face down again and lay down in the dark and listened to the bass breathe around her and thought about 9 names and waited for morning. Morning came at Fort Redstone, the way it always did, fast and without apology. By 0430, the base was already moving soldiers, pulling gear and running pre-mission checks with the focused economy of people who had learned that the time between briefing and departure had a fixed size and no amount of hurry expanded it. Lena was dressed and ready at 0410. She had not slept much. Not because she was anxious. Anxiety was a luxury that burned fuel she needed for other things. But because the 9 names in her notebook had a way of rearranging themselves in the dark, and she had spent 3 hours lying still and letting them rearrange until the order felt right. By the time she got up, she had a working sequence. Not certainty. A sequence. The difference mattered. The restricted briefing at 0500 had 4 people in it. Marshal Dylan Rodriguez and Lena. The route was drawn on paper, not entered into any digital system. Marshal read it aloud once they all memorized it, and then he folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket. Nobody photographed it. Nobody took notes. If Holt or anyone else with system access tried to pull the operational plan from the base's planning software, they would find the same route from the previous mission, because that was the only route that had been formally logged. The deception was simple. Simple deceptions were the ones that held. Dylan watched Lena during the briefing with a quality of attention that was different from what it had been even 24 hours earlier. Less assessment, more collaboration. She could feel the shift in the room's geometry, the way the 3 men adjusted slightly toward her rather than around her, the way Marshall directed explanations at her rather than past her. 8 days to get here. She'd worked faster in worse conditions. She'd also worked slower and paid for it, and the memory of that cost was always present, a weight distributed evenly enough that she rarely noticed it, except at moments like this one, when she was about to move from preparation into action. Communication windows, Marshall said. Carter, you're running 2 channels simultaneously. Standard operational, on primary, and a secondary low-power frequency that doesn't route through base systems. That secondary channel is the one I want you watching. If Holt transmits, she said, it'll be on a frequency adjacent to our operational band. Close enough to use standard equipment, different enough to avoid routine monitoring. I'll set the secondary receiver to scan the adjacent spectrum. How long before we'd see a transmission? Rodriguez asked. Depends on when he decides it's safe to send, she said. If he's watching our departure, probably within the first hour of our route. He'll want to confirm we're heading somewhere he didn't expect. And if he doesn't transmit, Dylan said, then either he's more careful than his pattern suggests, or someone warned him. She looked at the room. Which is why this briefing has 4 people in it. Nobody said anything to that. They didn't need to. The convoy departed at 0530 with 3 vehicles, a reduced column compared to the previous mission. Smaller footprint, faster movement, and less of a signal to anyone watching the base's vehicle allocation logs. The route took them south-southwest instead of west, cutting through a sector that added 20 minutes, but kept them below the ridgeline that had sheltered the waiting vehicles the previous day. Lena sat in the radio vehicle with both receivers running, one eye on the primary channel and one part of her attention on the secondary scanner. The terrain moved past outside the small window, pale and featureless at this hour, and she catalogued what she could see of it without looking directly. The shadow angles. The vegetation density changes that marked subsurface water. The places where the soil color shifted in ways that told you about what had happened there recently. At 0612, 42 minutes into the route, the secondary scanner produced a signal. It was 8 seconds long. Encoded. The encoding was not identical to what she had pulled from the vehicle log the previous day, but it shared structural characteristics. The same hand, essentially adapting the method slightly, the way a person changes their handwriting when they think someone might recognize it, but can't quite make themselves write completely differently. She noted the frequency, the duration, and the timestamp without changing her expression or her posture. She did not transmit it to the primary channel. She wrote it in her notebook in a shorthand that looked to anyone glancing over like routine signal quality notations. 40 minutes later, they reached the station. The physical structure was as they had left it. The repairs from the previous day, intact, the power running, the transmission equipment functional. The platoon established a perimeter, while Lena went directly to the routing hardware inside the main equipment room. Dylan came with her, not because Marshall had told him to, but because he had made a private decision sometime in the previous 12 hours that staying close to Lena Carter was likely to put him in the right place at the right moment. She pulled the routing access log from the station's hard storage, not the networked log, which would have been visible to anyone with system access, but the physical storage device that recorded locally and was not accessible remotely. She had confirmed this access point existed from the station's documentation before the mission. Nobody else had thought to look for it. She plugged the data drive Marcus had given her into one port, and the station's local log into a second reader, and set them running a comparison. The comparison would take 11 minutes. Dylan stood behind her and watched the progress bar and said nothing for 9 of those 11 minutes. Then he said, "The signal you picked up on the scanner 40 minutes out." She looked at him briefly. "You saw me write it." "I saw you write something," he said. "I've been watching you write things for 8 days. That wasn't routine signal notation." She looked back at the screens. "It was Holt," Dylan said. "It was not a question." "The frequency matches his access signature," she said. "I need the log comparison to confirm the content pattern." "But you know?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I know." Dylan moved to stand beside her instead of behind her, which was not a dramatic gesture, but registered as one in the small space, a positioning that said, "I'm with you on this, rather than I'm watching you." "How long has he been doing it?" Based on the supply rotation correlations, Marcus identified at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Dylan repeated. He said it the way you say a number when it's larger than you were prepared for. That's 3 patrol cycles. He's been feeding our patrol data for 3 cycles. Timing routes and column composition, she said. The enemy contacts in the eastern sector that seemed like bad luck, they weren't bad luck. Dylan was very still. "We lost 2 people in the eastern sector in the 2nd cycle," he said. "Specialist Torres, Private Okafor. They were a vehicle accident in terrain that should have been passable, except we hit contact and had to take an emergency route that—" He stopped. "The emergency route was compromised before you took it," she said quietly. He was silent for 15 seconds. She counted them without appearing to count them. "He got 2 of my people killed," Dylan said. The progress bar hit 100%. Lena looked at the comparison output. Holt's access credentials appeared in the station's routing log 17 times over a 4-week period. 11 of those access events occurred outside his logged duty hours. 7 of them preceded enemy contact events within 48 hours by a margin too consistent to be coincidence. She pulled the data from both drives, transferred it to a secure card, and put the card in her inside jacket pocket. "That's enough for a criminal referral," she said. "That's enough for a lot more than a criminal referral," Dylan said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something cold and very controlled. The sound of a person managing something that wants to move fast. "Dylan." She turned to look at him directly. "I need him functional and on base when Marshall makes the move. If he runs or destroys evidence before we're back—" "I'm not going to do anything," he said tightly. "I understand the process." "I know you understand the process," she said. "I'm asking whether you can hold that understanding for the next 6 hours." He looked at her. The muscle in his jaw moved. "Yes," he said, and it cost him something. She nodded. She believed him. They walked out of the equipment room and back into the flat light of the compound and the platoon moved around them with the professional normalcy of soldiers running a cleared mission, and Lena carried the evidence card in her inside pocket and thought about the 8-second transmission Holt had sent 40 minutes into their route, sent at a frequency and time that suggested he was watching their departure from somewhere with access to the base's vehicle tracking system, which meant he knew they had left. And within the hour, he would know they hadn't used the logged route. She pulled out her radio and keyed Marshall's frequency. "Command, this is Carter. Package is confirmed and secured. Recommend immediate action on base time sensitive." Marshall's voice came back within 4 seconds. "Understood. Already moving." She lowered the radio. "Already moving," Dylan said. He looked at her. He was ready. "I told him last night to be ready," she said. "I didn't know when, but I knew it would be today." "You didn't tell me that." "No," she said. He absorbed that. "What else haven't you told me?" She looked at him steadily. "A few things," she said, "but nothing that changes what we need to do right now." He let it go. Because Dylan Cross had been a sergeant long enough to know that there was a difference between information being withheld because you were untrustworthy, and information being withheld because the person managing it understood compartmentalization in a way that came from real experience, and he had been watching Lena Carter long enough now to know which category applied. It still didn't make it comfortable. But comfort wasn't the priority. They reassembled the platoon for the return trip at 10:40. The secondary scanner stayed active during the entire return route, and it produced 2 more transmissions, one at the 18-minute mark and one at the 34-minute mark, both encoded, both on adjacent frequencies. The second one was longer, and its structure had a quality she recognized from her training as distress signaling. Not emotional distress, operational distress, the kind of encoding that meant the sender wasn't getting a response and was escalating. Holt was transmitting to someone who wasn't answering, which meant Marshall had already closed the net. The convoy pulled through Fort Redstone's gates at 1220 hours, and the first thing Lena noticed was the absence of Holt's vehicle from its usual spot in the logistics bay. The second thing she noticed was Staff Sergeant Briggs from base security standing near the vehicle bay entrance, with 2 MPs flanking him, and the specific posture of a man executing a plan he has been briefed on. Dylan noticed the same things. "It's already done," he said quietly. "Not completely," she said. "Holt's the transmitter. Someone on the other end was receiving." She went directly to Marshall's office. Marshall was at his desk jacket on the photograph that usually hung behind him, already removed and replaced with a blank wall. A detail that told her he had been told to expect a formal review and had been preparing his office for it. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of a man who hadn't slept, but the tiredness of a man who has discovered that something corrupt was living inside something he was responsible for. "Holt," he said. "Holt," she confirmed. 17 access events in the routing logs, 11 outside duty hours, 7 correlated with enemy contact in the eastern sector. She put the evidence card on his desk. "It's all there." "He's in custody," Marshall said. He didn't resist. He walked to the MP station when Briggs asked him to come in, like he expected it. "He probably did," she said. The transmissions on the way back had an escalation pattern. He knew the response channel had gone dark. He knew something had changed. "He's asking for legal representation," Marshall said. "Not talking." "He won't talk," she said. "Not immediately. He needs to calculate what talking costs him versus what silence costs him. That'll take a day or 2. Marshall looked at the evidence card. Then he looked at her. "The receiving end," he said. "Whoever he was transmitting to. Do you have anything on that? The frequency and encoding point toward a coordination node we've seen before," she said. "Not local. The node has been associated with 3 other operations in the region over the past 2 years. I have enough to submit to intelligence analysis for a source trace." "Is that what your actual mandate covers?" Marshall said. "Source tracing." She looked at him. "My mandate covers whatever is necessary to protect the operational security of this installation and the units that depend on it." He nodded slowly. "That's a very broad mandate." "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "Torres and Okafor," he said. Yes, sir. Their families were told it was an accident. Yes, sir. He looked at the blank wall behind his desk where the photograph had been. That changes, he said. Whatever the legal outcome for Holt, the official record for those 2 soldiers changes. That'll be part of the formal review, she said. I don't care about the review, he said. I care that their families know their people didn't die because of bad luck on a road. They died because someone sold them. He looked at her, and his voice had an edge that had nothing to do with rank. Make sure that's in whatever report you're filing. It will be, she said. She left his office and found Dylan waiting in the corridor outside. He had clearly been there for some time, standing with his back against the wall and his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who has been arguing with himself and hasn't finished. Holt's in custody, she said. I know, Briggs told me. He looked at her. Torres and Okafor. Yes, he exhaled. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of exhale that carries weight. I've been carrying the Eastern Sector incident for 4 months, he said. I replayed that route 100 times trying to figure out what we missed. What I missed. Whether I called it wrong, whether there was something I should have seen. He stopped. There wasn't anything to see. The route was already burned before we took it. Yes, she said. That's... He stopped again. Started over. I need a minute to sit with that before I know whether it makes it better or worse. Take the minute, she said. He looked at her. How do you carry it, he said. The cases where you were right, but too late, or close but not close enough. How do you... He didn't finish the sentence, but the question was complete enough. She thought about the photograph on her shelf. The 7 people, the desert, the inscription. You don't carry it the same way every day, she said. Some days it's just there and you work around it. Some days it's heavier. You learn the difference between weight that's useful, that keeps you precise, keeps you from moving too fast, and weight that just slows you down. And you try to keep the first kind and put down the second kind when you can. She paused. I'm still learning which is which. He looked at her for a long moment. Desert Serpent, he said. Just the name. Not a question. She didn't answer. That's what's on the restricted file, isn't it? He said. Or where the restricted file comes from. The corridor was empty, except for them. The base was moving around them in its normal rhythms, personnel walking past the far-end radio traffic from the duty station, the mechanical sounds of a large installation in operation. There's a review team coming from command, she said. Probably here by tomorrow morning. When they arrive, everything about this investigation goes through official channels, and I step back. Step back, he said. Meaning you leave. Meaning my function here is complete, she said. He absorbed that. Just like that. That's how it works. He looked at the ceiling briefly. The kind of look someone gives when they're organizing thoughts that don't want to stay organized. 8 days, he said. You've been here 8 days. You walked in, and I threw your bag on the ground, and I told you to get yourself reassigned, and in 8 days, you identified a mole with 6 weeks of operational access recovered evidence that clears 2 of my soldiers' families and redirected a platoon away from a coordinated ambush. He shook his head slightly. And tomorrow, you're going to step back. Yes. Does it ever... He stopped. Does it ever what? Does it ever get to you? He said. Going somewhere, doing the thing, and then disappearing before anyone knows what it cost. The question landed differently than she expected. Not because it was wrong, because it was precise in a way she hadn't expected from him, the identification of the specific thing that was hardest stated plainly, without armor around it. Yes, she said. He nodded. Not satisfied, more like he had needed to hear the honest answer, and having it was better than not having it. The review team, he said. When they talk to me, what do I tell them? The truth, she said. Everything you observed, everything you were told to your knowledge. If they ask about sources or methods you don't have clearance for, tell them you don't have visibility into that. And you? I'll have already filed my report. Will I ever be able to read it? She considered that. Unlikely, she said. Great. He said it without rancor. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who understands that some things are structured in ways that exclude him. She started to walk away. Carter, he said. She stopped. The people who were waiting on the high ground, he said. Holt's contact, the receiving end of the transmissions. You said it was a node associated with 3 other operations in the region. Yes. Those other operations, were any of them yours? She turned to look at him. His expression was careful. He was asking because he wanted to understand the full shape of what he'd stepped into. Not to challenge her, but because Dylan Cross was the kind of person who needed to know the scope of things. One of them, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Did that one go wrong? She held his gaze. Not the way the others went wrong, she said. But it cost something. He nodded. He didn't push further. Then I hope this one helps balance it, he said. For whatever that's worth. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she usually allowed herself. Then she walked back toward the barracks. She had a report to write. It needed to be complete and factual and formatted for a review team that would arrive tomorrow and would want everything documented and sourced and cross-referenced. She was good at reports. She had written dozens of them in situations more complicated than this one, in worse physical condition with less time and less certainty. But she sat on her bunk for 3 minutes before she opened her notebook, and she looked at the photograph that was face up. Now she had left it face up that morning without fully deciding to, and she looked at the 7 people in it, including herself younger, and the inscription, Desert Serpent, never again. She thought about Torres and Okafor, whose families had been told it was a road accident. She thought about 6 weeks of compromised patrol data. She thought about Gerald Holt, who had sat at his logistics desk collecting access and selling it by the packet, and who had walked calmly to the MP station when asked because he'd had enough time to assess that walking calmly was his best remaining option. She thought about the receiving node. 3 operations, one of them hers. The coordination entity that had been running local intelligence assets in the region for at minimum 2 years, probably longer. She thought about the fact that Holt's arrest, clean as it was, evidenced as it was, had closed one door and left another one open. The node was still out there. The coordinator was still out there. Holt wasn't talking, which meant the chain above him was intact, and currently assessing the situation, deciding whether he was reliable or expendable. In her experience, people in Holt's position were generally expendable, which meant someone would try to reach him before the review team arrived. She put the photograph face down. She picked up her notebook and wrote for 2 minutes fast and precise, then stopped and reread what she had written and made 3 corrections. Then she picked up her radio and keyed a frequency that was not on any of the base's standard channels. The response came in 40 seconds, a single click pattern. She answered with 2 clicks. Then she wrote a 7-word message in the shorthand that only 2 other people in the active operational structure were trained in, and she transmitted it on the low-power frequency, and she waited. The response took 90 seconds. 3 clicks. She closed the radio. The review team was coming in the morning. But tonight someone was going to try to reach Holt through a channel nobody was watching yet. And Lena Carter, who had been a trainee with a duffel bag, dropped in the sand, and was now in the space of 8 days. The person who had dismantled 6 weeks of operational compromise was going to be listening. She wasn't done. She was nowhere close to done. The base went quiet after midnight, but Lena didn't sleep. She sat with her back against the wall beside her bunk notebook open secondary radio on the footlocker beside her set to the frequency she had identified from Holt's transmission pattern. The receiver was set to passive monitoring, no transmission, no signal that she was listening, just the open channel and whatever moved through it. Nothing moved through it for the first 2 hours. She had expected that. Whoever was on the other end of Holt's line was careful. Careful people didn't panic immediately when contact went dark. They waited. They assessed. They looked for indicators that the silence meant capture rather than equipment failure or operational pause. And they looked for those indicators methodically, because a careful person in that position understood that acting on incomplete information was more dangerous than waiting. So she waited too. At 0137, the frequency produced a signal. 6 seconds. Encoded. The structure was different from Holt's transmissions, not the same hand, a different operator, but using the same underlying architecture. like two people writing in the same language with different handwriting. She recorded the timestamp, the duration, and the frequency drift pattern that served as a passive fingerprint. She did not respond. At 0201, a second signal. 8 seconds this time. The encoding structure had shifted slightly, an adaptation, like someone turning up the volume because they weren't being heard. The shift told her two things. The sender was not yet certain that Holt was compromised, and the sender was operating under time pressure. People with time on their hands didn't adapt their encoding within 20 minutes. People with deadlines did. She wrote both signals in her notebook and noted the time gap between them. At 0218, nothing. At 021, nothing. At 0249, a third signal. This one was different. Longer 14 seconds, and the encoding structure had shifted in a way that was not adaptation, but escalation. The pattern she recognized from intelligence training as confirmation request protocol. A transmission that essentially said, "We need to know your status, and we need to know it now." The sender was someone with enough authority to issue a direct status demand. Not a low-level coordinator, someone higher. She pressed the record function on the secondary radio and let it run. At 0255, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the bay. She did not move. She did not reach for anything. She simply listened to the footsteps and identified them as single-person medium weight, moving carefully but not slowly. Someone trying to be quiet without the practiced silence of someone trained in quiet movement. The footsteps stopped outside the bay entrance. Then Marcus Webb put his head around the doorframe and said in a voice barely above a breath, "There's someone at the MP station." She was on her feet immediately. Civilian or military? Civilian vehicle, 2 of them. They talked their way past the gate as logistics contractors. Night delivery. But the paperwork. He stopped, visibly working through his own urgency. "I was on duty watch. The paperwork is real. The company exists. But the names on the manifest don't match the personnel database for that company, and the delivery window is 3 hours outside the standard logistics schedule for that contractor." She was already moving. "Wake Dylan," she said. Quietly. "Nobody else." "What's happening?" "Someone is trying to get to Holt before morning," she said. "And they are very good at paperwork." She moved out of the bay and down the corridor with Marcus 2 steps behind her, and she was thinking about the 14-second transmission at 0249, and the person with enough authority to issue a confirmation demand. And she was thinking that a careful organization that had just lost its on-base asset would not send panicked operatives. They would send professionals with clean cover identities and real documentation, because that was the kind of organization that stayed operational through multiple compromises. That was the kind of organization she had been tracking for 2 years. Dylan met them at the intersection of the main corridor and the administrative wing. He was dressed weapons-ready, alert, in the way of someone who sleeps light by practice. He looked at Lena's face and read it without asking for a full explanation. "How many?" he said. 2, Marcus said. "Civilian vehicle. They're at the MP station with a logistics manifest." "Are they armed?" Dylan asked Lena. "Almost certainly," she said. "But they won't open fire on base if they have any alternative. Their objective is Holt. They want to reach him before the review team arrives and either extract him or ensure his silence." "Ensure his silence," Dylan repeated with the particular flatness of a soldier processing a euphemism. "Yes," she said. "So they're going to kill him," he said. "That's the most efficient outcome from their perspective." Dylan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, the specific click of a decision being made. "What do you need?" "The MP station has 2 duty officers on night shift," she said. "Holt is in a holding room on the east side. The contractors would have been told or would have assessed that the holding room has a single entry point. They'll ask to deliver to logistics processing and use the access to route toward the holding room." She was already walking while she talked, moving toward the base security wing. "We need to get to the MP station ahead of them without tipping that we know what they are. If we alert the duty MPs..." "Not yet," she said. "If they see an alert response, they abort, and we lose the thread back to the network." I need them to believe the approach is clean until they're inside. Dylan walked beside her. And then we closed the door. Marcus fell into step on her other side. He had the expression of someone who has moved past the point of questioning the situation and is now fully inside it. I'm in, he said. And it was not brave or performed. It was simply the statement of a person who had been paying attention for 8 days and understood that this moment was the one everything else had been moving toward. The MP station was a separate building adjacent to the administrative complex. At 0300 hours, the duty officers were managing the late shift with the competent tedium of night watch personnel monitors logs, periodic perimeter checks. The 2 civilians from the logistics vehicle had been processed through the visitor entry point and were currently seated in the waiting area, ostensibly waiting for a duty officer to sign their delivery manifest. Lena came through the staff entrance with Dylan and Marcus and found the senior duty MP Sergeant First Class, Yolanda Reyes, at the monitoring station. Reyes was 10 years in sharp and had the capacity for rapid context absorption that distinguished good security personnel from the kind who needed everything explained twice. Lena gave her 40 seconds of explanation. Reyes listened without interrupting. Then she said, "The tall one on the left has his hand resting on his jacket below the left shoulder. He's right-handed, and he's carrying." "You already had them flagged," Lena said. "Their paperwork is perfect," Reyes said. "That's what flagged them. Nobody's paperwork is perfect at 0300 unless somebody spent real time on it." She looked at Dylan and back at Lena. "How do you want to do this?" "Let them make the ask," Lena said. "When they request access to the processing area, grant it. Dylan and I will be in the processing corridor. Marcus, stay here with Reyes and hold the external exit." Reyes looked at her with the measuring expression of someone deciding how much authority to extend to a person they'd met 40 seconds ago. Then she looked at Dylan, who gave her a single nod. She turned back to her monitoring station. "Go," she said. Dylan and Lena moved into the processing corridor through the internal access door and positioned themselves on either side of the corridor, close to the wall, out of the direct line of sight from the entry point. The corridor was narrow, which was a disadvantage in some scenarios and a significant advantage in this one. Dylan's voice was very low. "The moment they see us, they'll know the approach failed." "Yes," she said. "So we need to have the conversation before they see us. We need to have the conversation before they decide the conversation isn't worth having," she said. "These are professionals. They'll assess the situation in about 3 seconds and calculate their options. If those options include shooting their way out, they'll take it. If the fastest path to the exit doesn't include shooting, they'll take that instead. How do we make sure it's the second option? We make sure they understand that I know who sent them," she said. "Not Holt, not a local coordinator, the network above Holt. If I know the structure, then whatever they were sent to protect has already been partially compromised, and eliminating Holt in a military installation stops being worth the operational risk." Dylan looked at her. "Do you know the structure?" "Enough of it," she said. "How much is enough?" She met his eyes. "Enough to say something specific when I walk out in front of them." He absorbed that. "And if you're wrong about what you know, then we do it the other way," she said simply. He exhaled once short and controlled. "You know I hate that answer." "I know." "Okay," he said. The door at the end of the corridor opened. 2 men came through it, moving with the relaxed purpose of people executing a plan they had rehearsed. The taller one was on the left, as Reyes had noted his jacket hanging with the specific irregularity of a concealed shoulder holster. The shorter one had his hands visible and his weight slightly forward, the posture of someone prepared to move fast. They had taken 3 steps into the corridor when Lena stepped out from the wall. She stood in the center of the corridor and looked at them with complete calm and said, "Tell your principal that the Redstone access is burned. Tell him the routing logs from Harker Station are in federal custody, and the frequency trace on the adjacent band goes back 18 months. And tell him that Desert Serpent sent the message." The 2 men stopped. They stood perfectly still for 2 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than people stop when they're simply surprised. 2 seconds was an assessment window. 2 seconds meant they had heard the words and were processing what the words implied about the person who said them. The taller one's hand moved slightly toward his jacket. Dylan stepped out from his side of the corridor. The taller one's hand stopped. The shorter one, who had not moved at all, said, "You're Carter." His voice was even, not hostile, the kind of voice that comes from training that separated emotion from function. "Yes," she said. "You've been here 8 days," he said. "Yes." "And you're telling us the routing logs from Harker Station go back 18 months. I'm telling you what's in federal custody," she said. "What your principal does with that information is his problem. What you do in the next 30 seconds is yours." The shorter one looked at the taller one. Something passed between them in the way of people who have worked together long enough to communicate without language. The taller man lowered his hand. Both of them turned around. Marcus Webb was standing at the entry door with Sergeant Reyes. They had nowhere to go. "I have 2 federal agents from a joint task force arriving with the review team at 0800, Lena said to their backs. "They'll want to talk to you. If you're still on this base when they arrive, that conversation happens here. If you're not..." She paused. "Then you've told your principal what you needed to tell him, and the conversation happens somewhere else, and that becomes someone else's problem." She let that sit for a moment. "I'd rather you stayed, but I'm going to tell you the truth about your options either way." The 2 men stood at the blocked door. The shorter one turned around. "Harker Station," he said. "The logs you said go back 18 months. What does the routing architecture look like?" She looked at him. "Triple redundant. Regional node structure with 4 primary access points. 2 of those points are outside domestic jurisdiction." The shorter man's expression shifted by a fraction. "Just enough." "You know the architecture," he said. "I know the architecture," she said. He looked at Reyes. At Dylan. At the wall, like he was seeing something through it. Then he looked back at Lena. "We'll stay," he said. She nodded. Reyes moved them to a separate holding room with the efficiency of someone who had been ready for this outcome. Dylan stood in the corridor after they were processed and looked at Lena with an expression that had crossed from controlled assessment into something rawer. "You know the architecture," he said. "Yes." "Since when?" "The operation I mentioned," she said. "The one that cost something." He was quiet for a moment. "And what does knowing the architecture mean operationally, for the bigger picture?" "It means the review team arriving at 0800 isn't just reviewing a mole case at Fort Redstone," she said. "It means Redstone was a thread, and pulling the thread leads somewhere bigger," he said. "Yes." He looked at the door of the holding room. "Those 2 men in there," he said. "They're not the top of it." "Not close," she said. "So this isn't over." "For Redstone it's over," she said. "Holt is in custody. The access is burned. The review team will close the investigation on the local level." She paused. "The wider picture is a different operation, different team, different timeline." "Your team?" She didn't answer that. He stood with the non-answer for a moment. "Is there an investigation active right now above this one?" She looked at him steadily. "Right," he said. "I don't have clearance for that." "No," she said gently. He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor and then back up at her. "You said Desert Serpent," he said. "To those 2 men. That name stopped them." "Yes." "They knew it." "They knew what it meant to know it," she said. "It's not widely known. The people who know it are people who are close enough to the network to have encountered the operational record, which means they're higher up than a logistics contractor." "Yes." He worked through that. "And you wanted them to know you knew the architecture. You wanted them to understand that the information chain goes above what Holt could have given you." "Yes," she said. "Because if they tell their principal that Desert Serpent knows the architecture, then the principal has to make a decision about how much exposure they can afford," she said. "And that decision will produce behavior. Behavior produces signals. Signals are what we need." Dylan looked at her for a long, steady moment. "You used Redstone as bait," he said. It was not an accusation, more like the careful placement of a word for something he was still working out how to hold. "I used the Redstone investigation to surface a network contact that we haven't been able to locate through other means," she said. "Yes." "And the 2 men in that room are the contact." "They're a contact," she said. One of several. But the timing of their response, the speed of it, the quality of their documentation tells us something about where they're positioned in the structure. I was quiet for a while. She let him be quiet. She had found in 8 days that Dylan Cross processed difficult information, the way careful people do, by letting it settle fully before responding to it, rather than responding to the surface of it and getting the deeper part wrong. "My platoon," he said finally. "This whole time, we've been part of a wider operation. You've been doing your jobs," she said. "Everything that happened to this unit, the compromised patrols Torres and Okafor, the ambush setup, that was real. That was real harm done to real people. The investigation response to it was also a real investigation. Both things are true. But we were also—" "You were never bait," she said firmly. "The network's interest in Redstone preceded my assignment here. I was sent because the interest existed, not to create it. There's a difference." He looked at her. "Is there?" he said. And he wasn't challenging her, he genuinely wanted the answer. She held his gaze. "The people on that high ground were already there before I arrived," she said. "Holt was already transmitting before I arrived. Torres and Okafor were already gone before I arrived. I didn't create any of that. I came to stop it." She paused. "I believe that's different. I think you do too." He was quiet. "Yeah," he said at last. "I do." He moved toward the exit, then stopped. "Marcus," he said. "He figured out Holt's supply correlation on his own 3 weeks ago, before you arrived." He did. He was sitting on information that could have blown the case if he'd taken it to the wrong person. He was sitting on it because he didn't know who the right person was, she said. When he decided I was the right person, he gave it over in 30 seconds. Dylan looked at the door again. "He's good," he said. "He's excellent," she said. "He should be doing a lot more than radio maintenance." Dylan nodded, slow and deliberate, the nod of a sergeant, making a mental note about personnel. "I'll put in a recommendation," he said. "Do it before the review team starts pulling unit records," she said. "Recommendations made before a formal review carry more weight than ones made after." He gave her a look. "You've done this before." "A few times," she said. He walked out. She stood in the corridor alone for a moment. The building had the particular quality of sound it gets at DO 330, distant mechanical hum. The occasional footstep from the duty station. The sense of a large structure breathing at its lowest register. She was aware in the specific way she was always aware after a critical moment, resolved of the gap between what had just happened and what could have. The taller man's hand had moved. It had stopped. A margin of seconds, a margin of information, and the corridor was quiet, rather than a crime scene. She had been in corridors where it went the other way. She went back to the monitoring station and sat with Reyes, while the logs updated, and she wrote the formal incident report on the 2 men in holding with the precision that review teams needed: timestamp, action response outcome, evidentiary value of the contact. At 0415 she was finished. At 041 MSIN, her secondary radio produced one more signal. This one was different from all the previous ones. It was short, 4 seconds, and it was not encoded in the standard pattern. It was encoded in a pattern she recognized from a completely different context. A context that was 6 years old and several thousand miles from the Arizona desert. It was a personal signature. Her hands stayed perfectly still on the table. She had not heard that signature in 6 years. She had believed with the certainty that comes from official documentation and operational record that the person who used it was no longer active. She recorded it. She sat with it for 45 seconds. Then she picked up the radio and transmitted a single response, 2 seconds, 3 specific tones that said in the language only 2 people knew. "I heard you. I'm here." No response came. She did not expect one. Whoever was on the other end had said what they wanted to say and gone quiet. That was the discipline of it. But the message had been sent. And the message, stripped of its encoding, said one thing with absolute clarity. What was happening at Fort Redstone was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that had been in preparation for a very long time, and the person who had sent the message wanted Lena to know that she was not operating alone. She had thought she was operating alone. She had been wrong. She sat in the quiet monitoring station at 0432 in the morning with that knowledge, and she looked at the wall, and she breathed carefully, and she let it reorganize everything she thought she understood about why she had been sent here and who had sent her. By 0500, she had made two decisions. The first was that the review team at 0800 would receive everything. The full evidentiary package, the two men in holding the incident report, the signals log, including the final transmission at 0417. Everything except the personal signature. The second was that when the review team released her from Redstone, she would not go back to whatever holding position she had been in before this assignment. She would go toward the signature, toward the person who had sent it, because 6 years was a long time to believe something that was wrong, and she had been carrying the weight of that belief as one of the pieces she couldn't put down, and now the weight had shifted, and she needed to find out what that meant. At 0600, she went back to her bunk. She put on a clean uniform. She picked up the photograph from the shelf and looked at the 7 people in it. At herself younger. At the inscription. Desert Serpent. Never again. She thought about who had written that, and when, and what they had meant by it. She turned the photograph over in her hands. On the back, written in different handwriting, newer added later in ink she recognized, were 4 additional words. She had not noticed them before. She had never turned it over. Not until tonight. She read the 4 words. She read them again. Then she set the photograph down very carefully, face up with both inscriptions visible to the empty room, and she went to sit outside the holding facility to wait for 0800, with the particular clarity of a person whose understanding of their own mission has just fundamentally changed. The desert around Fort Redstone was beginning to lighten in the east. The review team would arrive in 2 hours. And whatever Lena Carter had thought this assignment was, it was something different now, something larger, and it had found her rather than the other way around. The review team arrived at 0752, 8 minutes ahead of schedule, which told Lena everything she needed to know about how seriously Command was taking the Redstone case. There were 6 of them. 2 JAG officers, 1 signals intelligence analyst from a division she recognized by the badge but not the faces. 1 federal agent from the Joint Task Force, whose name she already knew from prior operational overlap, and 2 people in civilian clothes, whose agency affiliation was not printed on anything they carried. Lena had worked with people from that particular agency before. They identified themselves by what they didn't say rather than what they did. She met them at the gate with Marshall. The federal agent, a woman named Carver, with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried precision of someone who had conducted enough high-stakes interviews to stop performing urgency, shook Lena's hand and said, "You moved fast." "The timeline required it," Lena said. "The 2 men in holding," Carver said. "You got them to stay voluntarily." "I gave them accurate information about their options," Lena said. "They made a rational decision." Carver looked at her for a moment. "Desert Serpent," she said quietly, not broadcasting it a private acknowledgement one professional to another. "Yes," Lena said. Carver nodded once and moved toward the administrative building with the rest of the team, and Marshall walked beside her, and the base opened around them, the way institutions open. When authority walks through doors, moving ahead, personnel, stepping back, the whole machinery of a large organization, recognizing something above its pay grade. Lena followed at the back of the group. Dylan was standing near the entrance to the administrative wing. He had been there since 0700, she suspected, because that was the kind of person he was, early to everything that mattered. He looked at the review team, and then at Lena, and his expression asked a question without his mouth moving. She gave him a small nod. He exhaled. Some of the tension in his shoulders released by a fraction. The formal interview process began at 0830 and ran in parallel across 3 rooms. Lena was in the first room with Carver and one of the civilian agency personnel. Marshall was in the second room with the JAG officers. The 2 men from holding whose names it emerged were not the names on their contractor IDs. A surprise to no one in the building, were in the third room with the signals analyst and the second JAG officer. Carver conducted the interview with the economy of someone who had already read the full written report and was using the interview to fill gaps rather than establish the narrative from scratch. She moved quickly, asked precise questions, and when Lena answered, she wrote a single word or two, rather than full sentences, the shorthand of a person who trusted her own recall and used notes as anchors rather than transcripts. At the 40-minute mark, Carver set her pen down. "The transmission at 0417, she said. "You logged it. You described the encoding structure. You noted it as distinct from the other signals." She looked at Lena. "You didn't describe the content." Lena had known this moment was coming. She had been deciding since 0432 that morning exactly how to handle it. "The content was a personal operational identifier," she said. "I flagged it as potentially relevant to a wider investigation and held the specific detail for direct briefing rather than written report." Carver looked at her without expression. "A personal operational identifier," she repeated. "Belonging to?" "Someone I believe to be inactive," Lena said, "based on a record I was given 6 years ago." "And the record was wrong." "The record was incomplete," Lena said. "There's a difference." Carver was quiet for a moment. The civilian agency person on her left, who had not spoken once in 40 minutes, shifted in his seat by half an inch. That was the equivalent in someone trained the way he was trained of leaning forward. "Who is it?" Carver said. "His name is Gideon Marsh," Lena said. The civilian agency man stopped shifting. Carver's expression did not change, but her right hand moved to her pen and picked it up, which was the first time in 40 minutes she had reached for it without having something to write. "Gideon Marsh," she said, and her voice was completely level, which meant she was managing a reaction. "Yes," Lena said. "Marsh has been listed as inactive for 6 years, Carver said. "I know. I was the one who filed the last operational report on him before the listing changed," Lena said. "I know what the record says. The transmission at 0417 used a personal encoding signature that Marsh developed during a joint operation in 2019. It is not a signature that could be replicated without direct knowledge of the methodology. The methodology was never written down." The room was very quiet. "You're certain?" Carver said. "Yes," Lena said. Carver set the pen down again. She looked at the civilian agency man. Some communication passed between them that occupied no words and approximately 2 seconds. Then Carver looked back at Lena. "When you responded to the transmission?" 2 seconds, 3 tones. Standard acknowledgement protocol from the same 2019 operation," Lena said. "And there was no further transmission?" "No." "He heard you confirm and went dark?" "Yes." Carver was quiet for 10 seconds. She was not thinking about what Lena had said. She had processed it in the first 2 seconds. She was thinking about what it meant and what it required and how fast they needed to move. "The Redstone case," Carver said finally. "Holt the routing logs the 2 men in holding, that's complete. That goes through standard review channels, and it's solid. The JAG team will have what they need by this afternoon." She looked at Lena. "But Marsh is a different operation," Lena said. "Are you formally requesting assignment to it?" "I'm formally informing you that I received a contact from a previously listed inactive asset who appears to have direct knowledge of the network structure feeding the Redstone compromise," Lena said. "What command does with that information is command's decision." Carver almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to a smile, but it came close. "That's a very careful way of saying yes." "Yes," Lena agreed. The interview concluded at 0940. Lena came out of the room and found Marshall waiting in the corridor, not because he had been told to wait, but because he was the kind of commander who wanted to know what was happening in his installation before it was formally communicated to him. "How did it go?" he said. "The Redstone case is solid," she said. "Holt the evidence chain the 2 men in holding. It'll hold up through a full court-martial." He nodded. "Torres and Okafor. The JAG team has the evidence needed to reclassify their deaths as a result of compromised operational security rather than accident," she said. "The official record will change." He closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, they were steady. "Their families. The notification process starts through JAG," she said. "It will be handled correctly." He nodded. He looked like a man who had been carrying a specific weight and had just felt it begin to shift toward people who were equipped to carry it. And the relief of that was complicated, because the weight itself was grief, and grief doesn't fully transfer. "What else came out of the interview?" he said. She looked at him. "Nothing I can brief you on yet," she said. "But the review team will have a summary for you by end of day." He accepted that. "You're leaving," he said. It was not a question. "My function here is complete," she said. "The review team takes it from here." He looked at her for a long moment. "My function here is complete," he repeated slowly. "That's the third time I've heard you say some version of that sentence. It always sounds like it costs you something." She was quiet. "Does it?" he said. "Every time," she said. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, and his eyes were direct, and he said, "Whatever you do next, whatever the next function is, be careful." "I will," she said. "I mean it," he said. "Not as a formality, I mean it." She understood the difference. "I know," she said. She found Dylan in the vehicle bay, which was where he went when he needed to think she had learned, not because he was good with his hands, the way Marcus was, but because the bay had a quality of mechanical honesty that he found reliable. Everything in it did what it was designed to do. The function was visible. He heard her come in and didn't turn around immediately. When he did, he had the expression of someone who had been working himself up to a conversation and had decided to lead with the hard part. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes." "Today." "Within the hour," she said. He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. "The review team took everything. They have what they need for Redstone." He heard what she didn't add to that sentence. "But not for the wider thing. The wider thing is ongoing," she said. "And you're going toward it." "Yes." He looked at the floor, then back at her. 8 days, he said, for the third time. But this time it had a different quality, not accounting, not assessment. More like someone holding a duration in their hands and feeling its weight. 8 days, she confirmed. "It's not enough time to know someone," he said. "No," she said. "But it's enough time to know what someone is," he said. "The kind of person they are, what they're made of." He looked at her steadily. "I know what you're made of." She held his gaze. "I threw your bag on the ground," he said. "On your first day, in front of 63 people, and you were already 3 days into an active investigation." "Yes, and you never used it against me," he said. "Not once. Not when you could have. Not when I dismissed your terrain call. Not when I shut down your radio observation. Not when it would have been easy." He stopped. "Why?" She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "Because the investigation didn't need me to use it against you," she said. "And because what you were doing, the aggression, the dismissal, it wasn't cruelty. It was protection of the wrong kind, pointed in the wrong direction. There's a difference." "You keep making that distinction," he said, "between things that look the same." "Because it matters," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Marcus, write the recommendation today," she said. "Before end of business. Don't wait for the review team to finish." "Already drafted it this morning," he said. She looked at him. "I pay attention too," he said. "You're not the only one who can read a situation." The edge of something came into his voice that was close to humor, not quite, but in the neighborhood. It was the first time she had heard it from him, and it changed his face in a way that was significant. She realized, standing in the vehicle bay at Fort Redstone at 10:08 in the morning, that under different circumstances, Dylan Cross was probably someone she would have genuinely liked from the start. "Gideon Marsh," she said. He went still. "I'm telling you that name because you'll hear it eventually, and I want you to hear it from me first," she said. "He's connected to the network that fed Holt. He's connected to the contact chain. And he was listed as inactive for 6 years. Was, Dylan said. "He transmitted to me last night," she said, using an encoding signature from a joint operation in 2019. Dylan's jaw tightened. "Who is he?" "He was my team leader," she said. 6 years ago, on the operation that produced the photograph." She paused. "He was the one who wrote the inscription." The bay was very quiet. Desert Serpent, Dylan said. He gave you that name. He led the team that earned it, she said. When the operation collapsed, he was the one who made the call that saved the civilians. He was the one who brought everyone home. She held Dylan's gaze. And then the military listed him as inactive, and I was told the reasons were classified, and I accepted it because I didn't have clearance to question it, and I have been operating for 6 years on the basis that he was gone. Dylan stared at her. He's not gone. No, he's inside the network, Dylan said slowly. I don't know whether he's inside it or working against it from within it, she said. That's the difference I need to find out. Dylan looked at her for a long moment. The 4 words on the back of the photograph, he said. The ones in the different handwriting. She looked at him. I didn't look at it, he said quickly. I couldn't see it from the doorway. But you said you turned it over and saw something. Last night before you went to the holding facility. He paused. What did they say? She had not told anyone about the 4 words. She had carried them for 6 hours through the interview, through the hallway conversation with Marshall, through everything. She looked at Dylan Cross, the man who had thrown her bag on the ground, who had dismissed her terrain reads, who had told her to stay on, assigned frequencies, who had believed exactly the wrong things about her, for exactly the right reasons, and who had spent 8 days being wrong and then being right, and had handled both with the same fundamental seriousness. She trusted him. That was the simple fact of it. She trusted him. They said I'm still in the field, she said. Dylan absorbed that. Marsh wrote that on the back of the photograph. Yes, at some point after the photo was taken, after the inscription was added, before it ended up in my possession. She paused. I don't know when he added it. I don't know how the photograph reached my shelf with those words already on it. I only know that it did. Someone put it there, Dylan said. In your kit before this assignment. Yes. Someone who knew you were coming here. Who knew what you were looking for. Who wanted you to know. That the thing I thought was over wasn't over, she said. Dylan exhaled. He looked at the floor, then the ceiling, then back at her, and his face had the expression of a man working through something at high speed. If Marsh is embedded in the network, he said, then the network has someone inside it who knows everything we know. Yes. And if he's working against it from the inside, then we have an asset in a position nobody has been able to reach in 6 years, she said. Either way, Dylan said, you going toward him is necessary, she said. I was going to say dangerous, he said. Also that, she said. He looked at her. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they are going to worry about in their absence, which is a specific kind of looking, longer than casual, more deliberate than assessment, carrying something that doesn't have a clean military term for it. If you find him, he said, and he's not what you hope, then I'll deal with that when I find it, she said. That's not a plan. No, she said. It's a decision. Plans come after. He stood with that. Then he said, is there anything I can do from here for whatever comes next? She thought about it. Keep running the 17th the way you ran it before I got here, she said. Except without the part where you decide who belongs before you have the information. He accepted the correction with the seriousness it deserved. Noted, he said. And listen to Marcus, she said. He sees things you miss, not because you're not good, because you're looking at different things. You need both. Already noted, he said. She reached into her jacket pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the workbench beside him. That's a frequency, she said. If you ever pick up a transmission on it from anywhere, any context, you write down the timestamp, the duration, and the encoding structure. If you can identify it and you get it to Carver through the JAG contact information in the review team's documentation. He looked at the paper without picking it up. You think Marsh will transmit through Redstone again? I think he reached me here for a reason, she said. And if that reason extends beyond the initial contact, he'll use a channel he knows I've established as trusted. And you're establishing that channel through me, Dylan said. I'm asking you to be a relay point, she said. Only if something comes through. You don't monitor it. You don't transmit on it. You don't tell anyone it exists unless something comes through first. And then I tell Carver. Then you tell Carver, she confirmed. He picked up the paper. He folded it once and put it in his breast pocket. He did not make a production of it. She moved toward the bay exit. Carter, he said. She stopped. The photograph, he said. You're taking it with you. It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. Yes. Good, he said. She left the vehicle bay and crossed the compound to the barracks. She packed everything in 7 minutes. The economy of someone who had never fully unpacked, who had distributed her belongings with one eye always on the possibility of departure. The notebook went in the inside jacket pocket. The evidence card had already been transferred to Carver. The secondary radio was logged and returned to the equipment room. The photograph went in the top of the duffel bag, where she could reach it without unpacking. Marcus Webb was sitting on the footlocker across from her bunk. He had come in while she was packing, and had sat down with the quiet presence of someone who knew there wasn't much to say, and had decided to say it anyway. Holt, he said. It'll hold up. It'll hold up, she said. Your vehicle log data was the piece that made the timing correlation solid. Without it, we had the routing access and the frequency match. With it, we had the operational signature. I just noticed it didn't make sense, he said. Noticing things that don't make sense and doing something with them, she said. That's the job, the whole job. Everything else is just the structure around it. He looked at his hands for a moment. Dylan's putting in a recommendation. I know, she said. You told him to. I told him you were excellent, she said. He already knew it. He just needed someone to say it out loud first. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Where are you going? That's not something I can answer, she said. Is it something you know? She looked at him. Partially, she said. He nodded. He understood partial answers. He had been living with one about himself for 8 months. The partial answer about what he was capable of that nobody had formally recognized. Will you come back, he said. To Redstone. No, she said. This was a specific assignment. Right. He stood up. He extended his hand, which was a gesture with more weight in it than it appeared to have, because Marcus Webb did not extend his hand casually. She shook it. His grip was firm, and his eyes were direct, and he said, Whatever you're going to next, be right about it. I'll try, she said. No, he said. Don't try. Be right about it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her duffel and left the barracks. The review team's vehicles were parked outside the administrative building, and Carver was standing near one of them, reviewing a document with the signals analyst. She looked up when Lena approached. We're releasing you from site at 1100, Carver said. Transport is arranged. The 2 men in holding, Lena said. When they go into formal custody, keep them separate from each other and from the federal system for at least 72 hours. Why? Because whoever sent them will be looking for a way to assess how much they talked, she said. If they enter the federal system immediately, there are channels for that assessment that we can't fully control. 72 hours of isolated custody makes the assessment harder and may produce behavior from the network that we want to see. Carver looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the signals analyst, who gave a small nod. We'll arrange it, she said. And Holt, Lena said. He'll start talking within 48 hours. What makes you say that? He's been in that logistics role for 9 years, she said. He has habits, routines, a sense of institutional standing. Isolation degrades that faster in people like him than in people who are ideologically committed. He's not ideologically committed, he's financially committed. The financial motivation stopped paying dividends when he was arrested. He'll calculate that cooperation is the next best available option. Carver nodded slowly. You've spent time with people like him. More than I'd prefer, Lena said. Carver looked at her. Marsh, she said quietly. Yes. The team is working on source location based on the transmission timestamps, Carver said. The signal analysis is ongoing. We'll have a geographic range within 48 hours. I know, Lena said. I'd like to see the range when it's ready. You'll have it, Carver said. The transport arrived at 10:55. It was a standard military vehicle, nothing that attracted attention, driven by a specialist who had been briefed to drive and not to ask. Lena put her duffel in the back and stood beside the vehicle for a moment. The base was running its morning operations around her personnel, moving vehicles, cycling the constant managed activity of a large installation. The parade ground where her bag had been thrown onto the sand 9 days ago was empty now, raked clean by the morning detail, indifferent to everything that had happened on it. She looked at it for approximately 3 seconds. Then she got in the vehicle, at the gate. As the vehicle slowed for clearance, she saw Dylan Cross standing near the security post. He was not positioned there for any official function. He was standing there because he had chosen to be there with his arms at his sides and his bearing exactly as it always was, correct and contained. He did not wave. She did not wave. He gave her a single nod, the specific nod of one person acknowledging another, as an equal, direct, and without ornamentation. She returned it. The gate opened. The vehicle moved through. Fort Redstone diminished in the rear window, and then disappeared behind the terrain, and Lena Carter sat with her duffel in the back of a military transport on a desert road, going south, southwest. And she thought about the photograph in the top of her bag and the 2 inscriptions on it, one in the hand of a woman who had survived something and never wanted to forget its cost. One in the hand of a man who had apparently been alive and operational for 6 years, inside a network that nobody had been able to fully map. "I'm still in the field." She thought about what that meant. Not the literal meaning, she understood that. She thought about what it meant that he had wanted her to know it. That he had engineered a way to reach her specifically through a channel that could only carry meaning to someone who had been in the room where that encoding methodology was developed. He had chosen her. That was not a small thing. She reached into the top of her duffel and took out the photograph without looking at it and held it in her hands, and then she turned it over and read the 4 words again. "I'm still in the field." She turned it back to the front. 7 people. Desert terrain. The inscription along the bottom in the handwriting she had memorized without intending to, because some things become part of your memory before you decide to keep them. Desert Serpent. Never again. Never again had meant something specific when it was written. The promise not to allow what had collapsed to collapse again. Not to allow the cost to be paid again without a different outcome. She had been keeping that promise for 6 years in assignments that had no connection to the person who had asked for it. Now the assignment had a connection. Now the promise had a direction. She put the photograph away. Outside the window, the desert stretched in every direction, pale and enormous, and completely unhurried, the way terrain is unhurried when it has been there significantly longer than the people moving across it. She had worked in this terrain for years, in this assignment and the ones before it. She understood its logic, the way it conserved nothing and concealed everything. The way survival in it required you to stop fighting what it was and start working with what it gave you. The vehicle moved south-southwest. She had a range analysis coming in 48 hours. She had a name, a signature, and 6 years of questions that were no longer unanswered. She had been sent to Fort Redstone as a trainee, with no reputation, no badges, and no introduction, and she had spent 9 days being dismissed and doubted and underestimated. And in those 9 days, she had dismantled 6 weeks of operational compromise, identified a network contact, recovered evidence that would change 2 families' understanding of how their soldiers had died, and received a transmission from a man she had believed was gone. She had done it quietly, without announcement, without demanding recognition or waiting for permission, the way she had always done everything. Because Desert Serpent had never been about the name. It had always been about the work. And the work was not finished. It had never been finished. It was simply moving the way the desert moves, not dramatically, not all at once, but constantly, relentlessly, grain by grain, in a direction that eventually reshapes everything it touches. She leaned her head back against the seat.